Now, to get this going, first a couple of basic points. So the corona crisis is not just a medical crisis, obviously, it's also an economic crisis. What does that mean? Well, very basically, this means that over the last weeks, there has been a massive drop in economic activity, both on the supply side and the demand side. On the supply side, many businesses not being able to offer their services, for example, because they have been forced to shut down. On the demand side, consumers like you and I asking for fewer services because we have to stay inside our homes. How large the economic drop will be, we do not know. The magnitude of the event is still unknown because it all depends on the length of the crisis. Current estimates, however, say that we might easily see a 5 to 10% drop in GDP for this year, 2020 alone. And that is comparatively huge, larger than our last major economic crisis, which we faced after the 2008 credit crunch. What did the government do in response to this massive drop in economic activity? Well, it responded immediately by making large stimulus packages for companies. Initially, 90 billion euros by the Dutch government were reserved for this aim. And now we see that new stimulus packages are being negotiated in the government center in The Hague. Other countries had similar responses. A lot of this is general aid for companies that are losing their revenues, which are basically meant to keep these companies going, and in particular to make sure that they are able to keep their own employees in their jobs. And there are also targeted aid packages for special big companies. The example of KLM here comes to mind. If you've been following the news, you've seen that the airline KLM is in big economic trouble, and that the government is looking into the possibilities of making a special aid package for KLM. Now, governments taking over this role and stimulating companies by basically aiding them with large sums of money, that is a new unprecedented thing, at least at the scale at which we see it now. What it means is that the risk that companies normally have to face themselves, something we call their entrepreneurial risk, is being taken over by the government and now becomes the government's risk. What does this mean? I would like to think about this problem in terms of a trilemma. And I'm going to introduce this trilemma to you. First of all, not by talking about companies, but by talking about patients. And since many of you are medical students, this is familiar terrain for you, but the trilemma itself perhaps is not. Now, what is a trilemma? Basically, a trilemma is a very interesting choice structure. It's a structure in which you face a choice which has an impact on 3 different types of values. You see on the top hand of your triangle on the screen, the life of the patient as a first value, and the liberty of the patient and responsibility of the patient as the other 2 values. Now, each of these 3 values, you can try to realize in your choices, but a trilemma is a situation in which you will not manage to do so. You can only realize 2 of the 3, but not all 3. Which 2 of the 3, however, you choose and which 3rd value you sacrifice is up to your choice. This sounds very abstract, I realize, but let me now illustrate this. So, for example, think about option 1 that I've now introduced onto the PowerPoint. Option 1, and then I'm going to introduce an example here. So imagine we're talking about a patient who suffers from a car accident, an immediate car accident, and needs urgent help. Otherwise, he or she will die. And imagine also that this patient is not insured. Now, it was the liberty of the patient, the value on the left side of your screen, not to insure. And that might be a good thing for patients to be able to themselves decide whether or not they want to insure. But it also means that it's the responsibility, according to option 1, of the patient then to suffer the consequences. If you do not have insurance, then you will not get any medical treatment. So option 1 is the option where you say, okay, we respect the liberty of the patient, the decision of the patient freely made not to insure, but we then also say it's the responsibility of the patient to suffer the consequences. And we're not, as a government, going to interfere with that. Now, the value that is lost here is the value at the top end of the screen, the life of the patient. The patient might maybe die if the car accident was severe enough. A second option would be to say, well, that is too severe. That is, these consequences are too harsh. We want this patient to live. So let's treat the patient. Let's offer help, even if the patient was not insured. And let's pay for that out of the pocket of the government. Basically, in the end, then the pocket of all citizens who pay the government through taxation. So the government in option 2 offers health care and pays for it. This ensures the life of the patient, as long as the medical treatment is effective. It also realizes the patient's liberty, the choice freely not to insure or to insure as the patient himself or herself wishes. The value sacrificed here is on the right-hand side of your screen, the responsibility of the patient. So the patient does not have to take responsibility for his actions. It's the government who does. Some people find that objectionable and they say, no, it would be better to go to option 3. We should save the patient, as in option 2, and thereby guarantee the life of the patient, the value at the top end of your screen, but we should make it the responsibility of the patient himself to pay for this. And therefore, we're going to mandate insurance from now on, mandate health insurance. This value sacrifice here then is the liberty of the patient on the left side of your screen, and because the patient himself cannot decide anymore not to insure. You must insure. That's the whole idea of mandatory insurance. So here you see we have 3 very different options that are also recognizable in other medical choices. So think of debates about lifestyle choices, such as eating a lot and becoming very obese or becoming alcoholic. There are controversial ethical discussions about what to do with this. And one option is option 1. Well, we say, well, these people have themselves decided to have an unhealthy lifestyle. We should not treat them. Another option would be to treat them and pay for this collectively. That's option 2. The third option would be to say, well, we should treat them, but then they have to pay the bill themselves. A similar trilemma arises in these sorts of cases. Now, I want to take this general idea of a risk trilemma and what to do with risks that people take on in their lives outside of the medical sphere and onto the economic sphere. Here we go. I now call it the entrepreneurial risk trilemma. The entrepreneurial risk trilemma is about the risks that companies face. And I'm going to sort of apply the same 3 options that I've just laid out in the case of patients in the case of companies. Now, the first option that I want to discuss is the option 1 below on your screen. The option that in case an entrepreneur gets into financial trouble, governments should not support the entrepreneurs, should not support the companies in question. This again realizes the liberty, sort of honors the liberty of the company and the responsibility of the company, but it sacrifices the continuity of the company. So if we do not, in a case like the Corona crisis, step in as a government to help companies, then they have to themselves share the responsibility, bear the burden of the downturn that they face with their companies, and the company might get into severe trouble and eventually bankruptcy. This support, this response, not supporting companies, was actually our Dutch government's response in the early days of the Corona crisis. So early March, some entrepreneurs were complaining that because of the crisis that was then only in China, they faced export losses. They couldn't export as much as they used to towards China. And our government ministers said, well, that is entrepreneurial risk. That belongs to your own risk. When you run a company, it's a commercial risk you have to take on yourself. We're not going to compensate you for this. This option 1, no support by the government, is really the basis of our normal free market philosophy. There's a public responsibility which belongs to governments, which is to enable people to act on the market. For example, by making sure there are property rights systems and judges if there are conflicts between marketplaces. All of that belongs to the responsibility of the government. But the game of market exchanges itself is a private responsibility. And if in this market game entrepreneurs face a loss, well, that's all in the game. They should assume the entrepreneurial risk. So as I already mentioned, the values behind this strategy is to make sure that companies are free to make their own decisions. They are at liberty to assume risks, and some companies will face larger risks than others and will assume larger risks. And the responsibility of these companies then to actually bear the consequences of these risks themselves. The value sacrificed here is the life of these companies, their continuity. Now, when the crisis developed, quickly our government found this a strategy that was too harsh on companies, and it stepped in and started to support companies. And option 2 on your screen is basically what you have right now. Governments support and pay for the risk that originally was a market-based entrepreneurial risk that the companies should face themselves. Why did it do so? Well, because not supporting companies became quickly untenable once the crisis became really big in our country. Many employees would lose their jobs. If the government would not step in, we would see a decrease in demand. So these employees would not have income. They could not buy their products in the supermarket and not pay their mortgages. And our economy would get into a vicious cycle. So for the sake of the jobs of the employees that are employed by companies, the government stepped in. Another reason, which has less to do with employees, is that the continuity of these companies was important for the government itself. Companies have a production structure, and the government found it important to maintain that structure so that after the corona crisis, companies can quickly resume functioning back to normal. So most governments, at least in the Western world, chose option 2. This is striking. We should take a step back at how radical this is compared to normal times. It basically means that companies are seen as too important to fail. Maybe you remember after the financial crisis in 2008, governments did the same for banks. In the years after 2008, many Western governments supported their banks because they were being considered too big to fail, too important for our economies to allow them to go into bankruptcy. Now, basically, the government is broadening, is extending the same response to basically all companies that are in financial bad weather. This is very radical. It's a strategy that ensures the liberty and continuity of companies, but the value that is sacrificed here is responsibility. So companies are not in these extraordinary times themselves responsible any longer for their financial performance. If they have a loss in revenues, they can go to the government and ask for compensation, something they normally cannot do. This is a strategy which we should realize also has drawbacks. And I want to mention 2 of these drawbacks of the current government strategy. The first one is called moral hazard. Moral hazard is a phenomenon known in economic theory, which refers to the tendency to increase your risky behavior when you know that you are insured against a loss. And so when you know that you're insured against medical expenses, you might go on and do a very risky sport you would otherwise not do, because you know if you break a leg, you will get medical treatment. So that means that the gains of the activity are for you. So you have the fun of going out and doing this risky sport. But if there are losses, then these will be socialized. These will fall on the shoulders of the collective that has you insured. The insurance, a pool of all the insured people who together pay premiums to buy medical care. Banks, after the financial crisis, we realized this, they know, or they implicitly know, they will be saved if there is a huge financial crisis. So they know that they can keep the profits when things go well in the economy, but when they get into really big trouble, they will be saved by the government. And so so in the banking sector, moral hazard is a very normal phenomenon. And this is something that might spread out to the wider economy as a consequence of government actions undertaken right now. That people know, well, if there's a pandemic going on, then the government will step in. I will say more about what this means in a moment. Another drawback another disadvantage of governments supporting the companies in the economy at such a wide scale as we see today is that this causes a massive rise of the public debt. And future generations will have to pay back this debt. So we see in the Netherlands, for example, that the public debt instantly has risen from, I think about 48% it was, until 60% right now, or even higher in the coming years. Again, depending on how long the crisis will last. 60%, for example, refers to a public debt that is 60% of GDP. Public debt is always calculated as a percentage of GDP. Now, we saw also a rise of public debt after the financial crisis in 2008. And then we saw in the years after that, pretty big budget cuts on the public sector in order to save money and compensate for this rise in debt. So this is a bill that might in the end have to be paid. And then the question is, who will pay it? Well, future generations. Obviously, we all belong to those future generations living right now. In the coming decades, we will see in our near future and possibly in a longer future that the bill will come to us. But who is us here? I mean, the whole corona crisis also raises the question about who should pay amongst the larger public. And we already have seen in the last 10 years since the financial crisis more and more debates about income and wealth inequalities between citizens. I think these will also come back and even stronger so in the coming years when we will start to think more and more about who pays for the rise in government debt. At the very end of the lecture, I'll say a bit more about this, but let's get on. So these are two important disadvantages of government support of companies. People in the private economy might engage in more risky behavior with respect to the risks of pandemics, and in the future we will have to pay back the debt that is now taken on by the government. But you might wonder, what's the alternative? I mean, it's all very nice to criticize or at least show us the drawbacks of the current government's actions, but I mean, did it have any choice? Could we have done something else? Didn't the government simply have to bail out all the companies to the extent that it is doing right now? Maybe not. Let's see if what the other responses in the trilemma would say. And here I'm going to make a distinction between 3A and in a moment 3B, which I both locate at the right-hand side of the triangle that you are by now familiar with. One thing that the government could do is analogous to what the government does when it mandates health insurance in the example with which I started, the example of a patient who suffers from a car accident. Let's see what that means. And here again, I draw on the analogy with what happened in the banking sector after the financial crisis. Governments did a lot of things, but I want to focus on two of them here. Two things governments did after 2008 are the following. First of all, it asked banks to have larger buffers, to have more money in store, and this is called higher capital requirements, so as to be able to weather through future financial crises. And so the government basically said, we understand you didn't have enough buffers at the time that the financial crisis struck in 2008, but in the future you need to make sure that you yourself have the buffers in-house to make sure that you will not get into financial trouble as soon as a crisis hits. The second thing that governments did at the time was the creation of a single resolution fund, and this is a European measure, whereby a fund of money was created at the European level, a sort of common risk pool, paid for by premiums that the banks had to pay. And if a bank now gets into trouble, it can go to this fund and ask for help. So this is not a solution, a buffer at the level of a single bank itself, but at the level of the collective of the European Union, where banks belonging to one of the countries in the European Union can have to pay premiums and then can ask for help. Now, in the current crisis, you could imagine similar measures being taken. So you can imagine that we are going to ask companies in the future to have higher buffers per company so that they are able to weather through a couple of weeks or months of inactivity, as we see it right now in the corona crisis. We could also imagine that vulnerable sectors in our economy that cannot shoulder these financial burdens themselves need to insure themselves against future pandemics. I know this might sound crazy, but virologists predict, and I'm not an expert in that field, but this is what I've at least understood, that there might be future pandemics coming at us pretty quickly and with a pretty high frequency, and that we'll have to get used to this. Well, then we also need to think about whether companies have to take out insurance for these kinds of events that we are facing right now. This option 3 realizes other values than options 1 or 2. The values realized here are responsibility and continuity. So companies can continue to operate, but they have to bear the responsibility for doing so themselves by creating these higher buffers and insuring themselves against pandemics. The value sacrificed here, as in the other examples of the trilemma, is liberty, the freedom of the company not to insure itself. But I also want to discuss a 3B now, because you might say this is all very well and fine for the future. So we can in the future ask companies to have more buffers and to insure themselves against the risk of pandemics. But how does this help us to think about the current crisis that has already happened? Because the risk has already been effectuated. The coronavirus is already there, and the economic inactivity and the drop in GDP is already there. Well, here we could think about what I call option 3B, which is based on taxes and conditions. So you could say, well, for the current crisis, one way of making banking companies responsible is by taxing them. Again, this has happened in the past. After the financial crisis, a special banking tax was in the Netherlands implemented in 2012. And the purpose of this was to make sure that banks would themselves contribute to the recovery, the costs of the recovery after the financial crisis. But we also have seen crisis taxes on large wealth holdings after the Second World War. So once an economy is in major trouble, you might sometimes have special taxes to ask more of those with higher financial holdings, the rich. Another thing that we can do right now is to put conditions on government support. And in the last 2 weeks or so, we've now seen more and more discussion of this. This was absent in the first weeks of the crisis, but now we see how many people say that the government in its aid packages in the coming weeks should make sure that only those companies are supported who have not paid large bonuses to their CEOs, who do not pay dividend payments to their shareholders, and who do not buy back their own shares. Or at least companies that have to promise not to do so in the coming months or years as a condition for getting government support. Such a condition then is meant to make sure that companies will not use the money, the government support that they get, to pay their shareholders and CEOs, but they actually use it to pay the wages of their employees and make sure the company doesn't go bankrupt. There's also talk about more wider public goals that the government should impose upon companies as a condition for financial support. For example, in the case of KLM, there's now discussion about conditions to make sure that KLM operates more environmentally sustainably in the future in exchange for being saved by the government. As you may understand, all these conditions are highly politically controversial. So there's debate about this, as there is about everything I've so far mentioned. We are in the realm of politics, and in politics, we can always choose between various courses of actions, and each of them has its own ethical advantages and disadvantages. So some will be in favor of environmentally sustainable measures for KLM, and others will think this is unwise. These taxes and conditions do not have to be imposed uniformly. So we can also think about smaller companies having to pay fewer taxes than larger companies, or richer persons or richer companies having to pay more than poorer companies or individuals. All of this is a matter of distribution, and we need to have a political debate about who should shoulder these taxes and conditions and who should have to pay less. But the general direction of 3B is a very different one from option 2 that we've so far adopted in this country and many other countries. And option 2 does not impose any conditions or taxes. Now, finally, I also want to come back to option 1. So I've been talking about option 1 at the start when I said, well, this is what the government did in the first weeks before Corona came to the Netherlands. And when the government was asked about some Dutch companies who had lost export to China. And then the government said, well, that's just entrepreneurial risk. And I mentioned how the government quickly reverted to option 2, and I mentioned option 3 as an alternative. But option 1 is also an alternative in the current state of our debate. The government could also choose to go back to not supporting companies, but instead it could support citizens through direct income support. And this is a very different strategy. Maybe you've seen this in the news. Donald Trump has sent household checks to a lot of American households, and he insists on having his name on the check. That is, of course, a peculiarity of his character. But giving checks to households is a strategy in which you say, well, those citizens who need support, I'll give it to them as a citizen. I'm not giving it to the companies, I'm giving it to them. To be sure, Trump does both. So this is one measure out of a larger package. But you could imagine that this would be the only thing we do. We put all the billions of euros that we currently give to companies, we give them to households. Some people, and you could target households, those citizens who need it most. You could also say we give it to all households in the form of a universal basic income. In some circles, this has been an idea that has circulated for a long time, and it's also become more wider known in public debate in the last couple of years. A universal basic income is an idea which basically says the government should pay everybody an income, regardless of your labor market status, regardless of how much wealth you have yourself. In the current situation, this would mean that nobody who faces job loss would face income loss, or at least they would not face poverty and destitution. They would still have an income to fall back upon. Now, again, the values which are sort of realized if we would opt for income support of households is the liberty and responsibility of companies. So this option 1 revisited brings us a strict market state distinction. It's a strategy where we say in the market, companies should take risks, but this is not the realm of the state. So the state is not going to help entrepreneurs, even in the case of a severe economic crisis such as the Corona crisis. Instead, if we need to help people, then we help people, not companies. So the value sacrificed here is the continuity of the company qua company. Companies are just means to ends. They're not ends in themselves. They are just a way to organize economic activity. And we shouldn't sponsor these organizations that are just means. We should sponsor the people who are ends in themselves only. So it's a very different direction of thinking. I'm not saying I would personally support it, but I think it's interesting and it might be part of our policy mix. Trilemmas in general are always subject to the question, well, but is the trilemma actually that hard? Is it really true we can only realize 2 but not all 3 of the values that you mention when you draw such a triangle? Or can we somehow escape the problem? Let me mention 2 ways in which you might escape the trilemma. One would be a decision not to pay off our government debts at all. So we do not face the problem of the costs of rescuing companies if we say that we can simply bear this cost without doing anything. And Utrecht University economist Koen Teulings has recently published an article, you see the link in the PowerPoint, in which he actually argues that this would be the best course of action. People like Teulings say, well, debt and wealth in the end are two sides of the same coin. So if some people have a debt, if governments have a debt, this means other people's have a claim on this debt. They hold it as part of their wealth. If you have debtors, you also have creditors. So a very high debt is not necessarily problematic because it also means that there are quite a number of people who have a claim on this debt. And these two hold each other in check. And the level at which they hold each other in check is maybe not so important. To support this point of view, Teulings points at the example of Japan, which since a couple of decades has a 200% state debt, so much higher than the Dutch debt and even than the Italian debt, which is way higher than the Dutch debt. And apparently that is sustainable for a long period of time. So then you do not have to think about who should take responsibility. You just let the debt increase and then maintain it as it is. A very different way of thinking about what to do with big public debts is debt forgiveness. This is not, as in the first option, saying, well, we do not have to pay it off. This is, yeah, we do not have to pay it off, but we reduce the debt nonetheless by canceling the debt. So we say that debtors will not get the creditors will not get their money back from debtors. Creditors will have to accept that the debt is cancelled, that there is a clean slate between the creditor and the debtor from the moment the debt is cancelled. In the Bible, interestingly, this is called the Jubilee. It's every 49 years is the idea here. All debts in society should be cancelled, and all debtors should be freed from the oppression of their creditors by cancelling their debts. We see something similar, obviously, in certain situations in our own economic systems, to the extent that some debts are cancelled when bankruptcy is declared on either individuals or companies. For state debts, however, this has always been resisted by the creditors. So, for example, in the euro crisis in the last 10 years, the Greek government was, and still is, has a large government debt and was in severe troubles because of that. It wanted debt forgiveness, but it didn't get it from the creditors, mainly Northern European banks. But that would also be a way of escaping the whole problem that I've been talking about so far. Let's look at the time. I have 5 minutes left, and that is good because I'm coming to my last slide. So my conclusion here is that there are a lot of debates going on in the about our economy and whether our economy is in a healthy state. These debates have been there before the corona crisis, but they are cast in a new light because of the corona crisis. I just want to mention some of them. So one is about the buffers of companies. Companies have gotten used to a so-called lean and mean business model, in which they do not have a lot of cash in-house, in which they do not have a lot of products in-house, but in which they are very quickly turning over their cash when they have any to shareholders, so they're handing out dividends. They're very quickly turning over the products they have in their stores, and they try to deliver products just in time to their company, to their consumers. All of that depends on a world in which this is possible. But for example, if we need to have more local production in the future because the global supply chains are often easily disrupted because of pandemics, then you'll see that this whole business model will have to change. And if we impose financial buffers and more fat on the bones for companies as a government, then they will also have to change that. This might make companies more resilient than they are today. Another debate that has been going on for some time is a debate about corporate governance. Should companies be driven by the wishes of their shareholders, or should they look at a broader range of stakeholders? And if we now hear many people in Parliament and outside of Parliament talking about conditions on supporting companies, conditions such as not being able to pay dividends for a while, not being able to pay bonuses for CEOs, then what is at stake here is a different way of thinking about the reason why companies exist. They do not exist for their shareholders, they exist because they have valuable production in-house and they have employees who can make a living because of that. And this is what they should support. This is traditionally called a stakeholder model of corporate governance, and it might get increasing support in the years to come. Another thing that will have to change, I have not really been talking about this, is labor market policies. So many people have flexible work and they do not have permanent jobs. So the composition of flexible to permanent work in our economy has shifted over the last decades. More and more work is flexible, and all of that is at risk in the current situation, while people with permanent jobs, like myself with a permanent position at a university, do not suffer any economic backlash because of this crisis. Maybe in the future we're going to reconsider this, and there are already debates about this, and again these might be reinforced by the corona crisis. We'll also have to think anew about the relation between companies and the government, and the extent to which the government helps companies and how generous it is, how much strict conditions it imposes on companies. And we'll have to think about the relation between government and citizens, and who pays the bill of paying off the debts that are now being made, if they are paid off at all. And here, the already existing economic inequalities between citizens and the debates that we've had about wealth inequalities in the Netherlands and in other countries will again get new impetus because of this corona crisis and the economic effects that it has. And that brings me to the end. So I've hoped to give you some insight in the choices that are ahead of us. I hope the trilemma structure makes clear that there are no ethically neutral choices, that we always have to think about which values should we lay into our policies, similar to the values that we lay into our daily actions when we help patients or not help them, or impose conditions on them when we help them. So there's no ethically neutral way of acting, and we always have to reflect about what we feel is the most justifiable way of making these choices, and which moral values we think are important to adhere to, and which moral values we think we sometimes have to reject or sacrifice if we are in a dilemma situation, or, as I've tried to point out, in a trilemma situation. Thanks a lot, and now there's time for questions.
Thank you, Rutger. I scrolled through the questions and I would like to start with Robin C. Can you switch on your mic and your camera so Rutger can see you?
And Rutger, if you turn, if you stop your shared screen option, you can see everyone, and everyone is an invitation for you to turn on your camera so we see each other.
Okay, I've done so.
Is Robin still in the house? Robin asked, there was no possibility of ensuring such an event as it is an act of nature beyond control, isn't it?
Yes, so I think it's reasonable to say that it was hard to predict this event. At the same time, well, medical experts have warned for such a pandemic for already a couple of decades, since the SARS outbreaks and the Ebola outbreaks. So I think there are two things here. One is, could we not have predicted such an event happening? Well, maybe not this exact virus in the way it's playing out now, but that there are increased risks in a globalized economy in which people travel easily from China to Europe, to America, etc., etc. This is something itself that is not completely unpredictable. But the other problem with insurance is whether the magnitude of the risk is so high you can insure. So some experts, insurance experts say, well, it's very hard to pay the costs to insure against the cost of the current crisis because it's so massive. Nobody could afford the premiums. This only, of course, shows that the economic burden is very, very severe, and that the bill is very large. But if we do not pay the bill upfront through premiums, then we'll have to pay it after the event in the form of future generations paying for it. but it will have to be paid at some point, unless you just accept the increased government debt.
Okay, and I know that Wimbledon had an insurance. How did that work?
Oh, I missed that actually. Did Wimbledon have an insurance? I didn't know that.
Yeah, for 130 million pounds or something.
Okay, well, that's a striking fact. Yeah.
Okay, next question is from Maaike Wulse. Karen, can you ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I think it was already answered in the chat. I was asking what kind of organizations or parties give money to countries, or at least I want to know what kind of organizations have enough money that countries can have a debt to them. If you understand my question.
Yeah, so government bonds can basically be bought by anyone. You could also
Mm-hmm.
buy one yourself, and they're, especially if you buy a government bond from Netherlands, it's incredibly safe.
Mm-hmm.
Might be different from some other countries, but basically there are two players here. So one is richer households
Mm-hmm.
who generally buy stocks of companies, also buy government bonds. So let's say the top 10% wealthiest households have a portfolio through which they invest in this.
Mm-hmm.
The other ones are institutional investors, so pension funds and other investors that pool resources from, for example, all future pensioners.
Yeah.
Pay by government debt.
All right. Thank you. Staat op mute, Roos.
Roos?
Ja, ik moest even eerst naar mijn zoonskamer en toen weer terug naar de woonkamer.
I think the next question is from Carl.
Ja, dank je, Duke.
No worries. Carl, can we invite you to ask your question? And it's per the whole discussion in the chat that you didn't see, but it's about the basic income. Can I invite someone else to elaborate on the discussion so far and the outstanding questions?
Is Fleur still here? Fleur Jongepier?
Yep.
I didn't know you study medicine as well.
Well, it's open to everyone, Rutger.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I had a few questions. I'll pick one. So I'll take the most blunt one. So I was wondering what your view is on the basis of what you just told us, and thanks for that, by the way. If you could apply any of that theory to the discussion about bonuses, or whether we need a new value frame or a new political philosophy frame for that.
You mean the bonuses of CEOs in particular?
Yeah.
It's because, so I've put this in this category of conditions. So no share buybacks, no dividends, no bonuses. And I think for the purpose of the current crisis, it's in that box. So it's together with a couple of other things that are generally considered by the government to be the wrong kind of destination for government support.
Okay.
Now, I do think we need, in general, a new way of looking at bonuses. So I found it very striking, for example, today in the newspaper to read that the whole story about the KLM CEO's bonuses, that they wanted to make that the bonus of the CEO conditional on whether he or not he would be able to safeguard government support for KLM. Now, that is very ironic, of course, and that was taken back because it caused a massive uproar. It raises the question that it also did when we had the discussion a year ago, when there was this bonus discussion at ING Bank. To what extent the top of these companies is actually sensitive to the issues on the ground, the issues that taxpayers have with these bonuses.
Cool, thanks.
I see a question for Chrissy Fox. Chrissy, could we invite you to ask your question?
I'm still here.
Oh, Carl, you're
about
here. Okay, great. Christine, afterwards, it's your turn. Carl, please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. I had two questions. The first was about equity and whether or not having a universal basic income would still create moral hazard because it could because it would only support companies that are still able to function right now. And then my second question was, would making companies operate with more fat make them less efficient and make them less competitive compared to countries with less regulation?
So can I start with the second question? So this was the reason that started me thinking about this. So I think it is striking how few companies have the buffers currently to weather a couple of weeks of non-activity. This is just remarkable. And I'm not the only one who has noticed this. There's a couple of people who have written articles now really wondering why is it that there are so few buffers within companies that they can't withstand a couple of weeks of inactivity. And this is because of this lean and mean business model that I mentioned. So in many markets, the conditions are so competitive that companies feel they cannot hold on to these buffers. They have to, because other companies aren't doing that either, and having a buffer is costly. So the buffer has to go in a very competitive market. And this is why I think we would need to have rules mandating holding on to these buffers. Because otherwise companies would find it difficult in a competitive situation to hold on to them. So only sort of breaking that competitive deadlock and imposing it on all companies would, in that case, work. Now, there will be critics who say, why is all that money sort of at these companies doing nothing? This is a familiar discussion for those who follow university policy. So as soon as a university has a certain buffer, then the national government starts questioning why that buffer is there. Shouldn't the money just roll in the economy? Well, if the money always rolls and nobody has buffers, then that also means that once a crisis hits, then it is the future who pays. So this is a difficult, I understand this is a difficult choice, but it's not a choice, of course, between no buffers or an enormous buffer. You could think about a small but substantive buffer. Which would help us to pay upfront for these costs instead of having the future pay. But that in the end is a political decision. Sorry, can you remind me your first question that was about basic income?
Yeah, my first question was about the equality, and my second question was about the competitiveness after taking on this fat, or as you called it, this extra buffers.
Yeah.
But it seems like you touched on it in your answer as well.
Yeah.
More on international competitiveness.
So I mean, equality is that's an enormous discussion around basic income. So some people say that we should never pay a basic income to those who are already wealthy. And others, because that would be unjust. It would just be a waste of money and would be an affront, an insult to those who are really poor if we would use government money and pay it to everybody, including the rich. Other people say, well, no, in principle, a basic income should be for everybody. It's probably not going to be a huge income compared to many market wages. Let's say it might be 700, 800, 900 euros per month. Most market wages are higher than that. But it should be on principle for everybody. But that's a separate debate about basic income, obviously.
Thank you.
Okay, so Christine Fox's question was about a press release announcement in Amsterdam a few weeks ago, where they announced they would be applying a donut model to help mend its economy post-coronavirus. And her question is, do you think this is a model that fits with your analysis, and is it applicable to other countries?
Yeah, I haven't thought about that. I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. What does is she still on?
Her camera doesn't work. Maybe for everyone, can you summarize what the donut economy is about? Because I'm not sure if everyone is on the same page as both of you seem to. Could you elaborate on what the donut economy, what it's about?
She doesn't have a mic, but I can.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but I
no,
can maybe
yeah.
do it.
Yeah, or someone else.
I know the book. So the donut economy is like a diagram where we look at our social foundations and the means, the ceiling of our planet, and we are looking inside a donut, and it's like it's a way of looking where we are passing boundaries of our social needs, like having a roof under our heads, an equal kind of way of living, but also the ceiling of our the boundaries of nature. So for example, CO2 emissions, or the chopping of the Amazon, how much oxygen is there left in the air. I'm trying to explain it. I read the book 3 years ago, so it's for me a bit, but basically when you're making decisions about policy, you're looking in those two boundaries. And I don't know what exactly the question was, but yeah.
So there was a press release about this, which linked it to the corona. I haven't heard about the press release, but so it linked the donut model to the corona crisis.
Yeah, because the city of Amsterdam apparently is using the donut model as a guiding principle for their post-corona recovery strategy.
So what I've seen from similar, I haven't seen that press release, but what I saw from similar debates about the relation between the corona crisis in general and planetary boundaries and sustainability of our production chains, is that the corona crisis is good for sustainability in the short term, because obviously we have a much better air quality now that we have less pollution. There's much less flying, much less car traffic, much less industrial production. So it's good in that sense to hold us within planetary boundaries on the short term, but it's very uncertain what this means for the long term. So some environmental economists are also really expressing concerns that we're now holding back the necessary investments into sustainable industrial processes that need to be made, because these are also costly. So once the economic activity would resume, we might easily overshoot these planetary boundaries again. And we might even face a delay in the speed at which we're in the long term adapting the economy to a CO2 neutral economy. So I'm not an expert, and I can't predict what will happen. And I think it will depend on the length of the economic lockdown and the severity of the economic crisis. To what extent this will be a net gain for these boundaries or not.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question. Victor, would you like to ask yours?
Yes, I would. You were talking about pandemic insurance fund, like the banks got, or what's set up for the banks on a European scale. And you were talking about a similar fund being set up for businesses, and particularly maybe small businesses and hospitality. But is that something that would be, or would have to be done on a European scale as well, or at a national scale for every nation's government? Response to the coronavirus has been different. Mm-hmm. So maybe the impact on the economy has been different as well. Would you need to see that in creating the insurance fund as well?
So I think it would be insurance is generally more efficient at a higher level, because you have a larger pool of people who insures each other. So it would be more efficient to have it at the European level or even a global level. Because you could pool the resources of a lot of people and then target it specifically at those countries or even regions or cities that are hit most severely. And you could target the support. For some, it's medical support that is most needed. For others, it's support for small businesses. For others, it's just the airplanes that need support, whatever. It might be different in each country. The question is, this most efficient form of insurance at this highest level, will it be sustainable given the lack of solidarity between all the people in this much larger pool? So the reason why we sometimes see insurance just happening at a more local level or a regional or a national level instead of a European or global level is that we do not want to be in one pool together with others. And this obviously we saw in a very nasty way in the negotiations over the European rescue missions in the last couple of weeks, where the Dutch and some other countries said we do not want to actually cover the risks of Italy and Spain. So that it might be efficient, but it's difficult to make it work if there's not enough feeling that we're in one boat together. So feelings of solidarity to sustain these streams of money that would go across borders.
All right, thank you.
Welcome.
Rutger, I would like to ask you one more question. Do you think that like philosophers or economics should be more into the ORT or the advisory boards of the government right now?
I of course saw the calls for this last week when there was a call for economists, ethicists, behavioral scientists and others to advise the government. So I'm torn here because on the one hand, yes, I think it's good that the government uses a diversity of types of expertise to base its decisions on. But on the other hand, no, because there's nothing in the realm of economics, politics, and also ethics, as I've tried to show you, which I can dictate. So I can my expertise is to make the choices that we face explicit and to try to show what the structure of the difficult choices is and what are disadvantages and advantages of each choice. But I cannot make the choice. So as an ethicist, philosopher, I cannot say, I do not have the political legitimacy to make that choice. So I would find it dangerous if the government would now have a sort of second board with, let's say, social scientists and then humanities scholars joining the medical experts. But this second board would then be a sort of seen as a sort of politically neutral or a morally neutral board that makes just expert advice. No, there's always values embedded in all of this advice. And this is, I also think this is true for medical advice, but I think it's even more strongly so when we're talking about political and economic matters. And at that point, the parliament needs to step up. And I see my task and that of other experts in the university more as enlightening the general public and through that the public opinion and the whole debate that then goes into parliament, then setting up a new board if it would get a sort of technocratic aura of expertise around it.
Thank you. Well, it's past 8 o'clock.